Today, the Canadian Football League has 9 teams, all the way from British Columbia to Quebec. Those teams are the BC Lions, Calgary Stampeders, Edmonton Elks, Saskatchewan Roughriders, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, Hamilton Tiger Cats, Toronto Argonauts, Ottawa Redblacks, and the Montreal Alouettes. But how did we get to this point? From the beginnings to the 21st century, this video will go over the history of the league. The earliest documented game of football in Canada was played on the University of Toronto campus on November 9, 1861. The game took place on the site of what is now the Ontario Legislative Building, but was a part of the campus back then. This could have been the start of American football in the world, as the first documented football game in the United States was played 8 years later, in 1869, between Rutgers and Princeton. In 1873, the Toronto Argonaut Rowing Club formed the Argonaut Football Club, and they played their first game against University of Toronto on October 11th. Toronto then started their long-standing rivalry against Hamilton for the first time on October 18, 1873. In the 1880s, there were many rules that were added into Canadian football, the foundation of what we know football to be today. There was a creation of line scrimmage, along with a system of downs and snapback to start play. The 110-yard field of play also got introduced. Teams played 15 players per side, and games consisted of 2 45-minute halves. In the 1900s, the Ontario Rugby Football Union attempted to standardize the rules of the game in Canada. They implemented the 12 men per team, the system of moving the ball requiring the offensive team to gain 10 yards on 3 downs, and teams must line up 1 yard apart from each other on each play. Markers and chain use was adopted to measure. The Grey Cup was donated by the Governor-General Earl Grey in 1909 and was awarded to the team winning the Senior Amateur Football Championship of Canada. The Grey Cup has been an East versus West battle for the Canadian Football Championship since 1921, a game that featured Edmonton and Toronto. The only exception was in 1995, which will be covered later in the video. For much of the early part of the 20th century, the game was played by interprovincial leagues, or unions. In 1907, several of the stronger senior clubs in Ontario and Quebec formed the Interprovincial Rugby Football Union. It took almost 30 years for an elite interprovincial Western Union to emerge. When in 1936 the stronger senior clubs in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan formed the Western Interprovincial Football Union. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the Big Four and WIFU gradually evolved from amateur to professional leagues, and amateur teams were no longer competitive for the Grey Cup. In 1948, the Calgary Stampeders completed the first 12-game undefeated regular season in history and would go on to win the 1948 Grey Cup. But before the 1948 Grey Cup was played in Toronto, Stamp supporters turned the Grey Cup game into a Grey Cup week with their tireless partying in downtown Toronto. This was the start of the week-long celebrations leading up to the Grey Cup game. We'll now skip to 1956, when the Western Interprovincial Football Union and the Interprovincial Rugby Football Union established an umbrella organization called the Canadian Football Council. 2 years later, in 1958, it reorganized as the Canadian Football League, and they took possession of the Grey Cup. And there, we have the history that led to the foundation of the CFL. From 1958 to 1981, there were some minor rule changes. The introduction of the 2-point convert was adopted in 1975, a rule that the NFL did not adopt until 1994. The league was fairly stable during this time, in terms of the franchises. The CFL included the same franchises: the BC Lions, the Calgary Stampeders, the Edmonton Eskimos, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, the Hamilton Tiger Cats, the Toronto Argonauts, the Ottawa Roughriders, and the Montreal Alouettes. End of the original Alouettes. In 1981, Nelson Skalbania purchased the Montreal Alouettes. You may have heard of him before as he who is best known for signing a then 17-year-old Wayne Gretzky to the Indianapolis Racers of the World Hockey Association. But going back to the CFL story, Nelson used his history of big-name signings and signed several high-priced NFL stars, including quarterback Vince Ferragamo, receivers James Scott and Billy quote-unquote White Shoes Johnson. But Montreal only won 3 of 16 games that year, and their attendance started to decline. There were several attempts to sell the team due to the amount of debt they were in. Unable to find a new owner, Skalbania declared bankruptcy and returned the team to the CFL in May of 1982. The very next day, the team was reformed by the CFL as the Montreal Concords, owned by Charles Bronfman, who was also the majority owner of the Montreal Expos in the MLB. After struggling for 5 years, attendance was at an all-time low. Owner Bronfman made it clear that he would not field a team for the 1987 season unless the club sold thousands of additional season tickets. Right before the 1987 season, Carling O'Keefe Brewery dropped out of its deal to serve as the CFL's presenting TV sponsor. This would be the final blow to Montreal. The team played 2 preseason games, but folded in June of 1987, a day before the kickoff of the CFL season. CFL in the USA. In 1992, the World League of American Football announced it would suspend operations, and the CFL used this as an opportunity to expand south of the border. The first U.S. franchise would be awarded to the city of Sacramento in 1993, named the Gold Miners. The following season, the CFL would add new franchises with the Las Vegas Posse, Baltimore Stallions, and Shreveport Pirates. The next season, in 1995, the last round of U.S. expansion teams were added, the Birmingham Barracudas and Memphis Mad Dogs. The Sacramento Gold Miners were unable to secure funding for a new stadium and would relocate to San Antonio, then changed their name to the Texans. Most of these teams struggled due to a lack of CFL experience by only fielding rosters with former NFL, college, and locally known players. The Baltimore Stallions, on the other hand, figured out the CFL game was a lot different than the style of football in the U.S. Baltimore signed personnel and players with prior CFL experience. As a result, they were the first American team to make the playoffs. In 1995, the CFL changed its divisions from East and West to North and South. All the Canadian teams were in the North, with all the American teams in the South, guaranteeing a Canada versus USA team in the Grey Cup. The Stallions were also the first and only American team to win the Grey Cup. As in 1995, they defeated the Calgary Stampeders in Regina. This was also the last time an American team played in the CFL. As of the following season in 1996, the CFL in America experiment was over. All the American franchises disbanded, except for the defending Grey Cup champions, Baltimore Stallions. They relocated to Montreal and became the third incarnation of the Montreal Alouettes. In the 3 seasons that U.S. cities hosted CFL teams, fan support and interest was sparse at best. Only Baltimore produced consistently large crowds, more than likely because they were winning. The CFL was unable to secure a major U.S. television network to broadcast games, meaning teams had to rely on ticket sales for the majority of their revenues. End of the Ottawa Roughriders. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the Ottawa Roughriders struggled on and off the field. Between 1980 and their final season in 1996, they had 10 different head coaches. Alan Waters purchased the team in 1977 and lost $13 million in the following 10 years. He then sold the franchise for $1, yes, $1, to a group of community partners in 1987. The partners were severely undercapitalized and burned through their funds in less than a year. A series of emergency bailouts from the government and the CFL followed to keep the team afloat, but it was not enough. The team folded in 1996, ending a 120-year history of Roughriders football in Ottawa. The CFL did return to Ottawa in 2002 as the Ottawa Renegades, But they also ran into financial difficulties, folding only after 4 seasons. 2006. After losing the Ottawa Renegades, the league took measures to develop a sustainable business model. For the first time, a collective bargaining agreement would have a salary cap with the players receiving 56% of league revenues. The CFL board also approved the ability for teams to challenge officials' calls using instant replay. Return of Ottawa. We wrap up this video with another return of the Ottawa franchise. The Ottawa Redblacks were granted a conditional franchise on March 25, 2008. The team planned to begin play in 2010, but due to issues with Frank Clair Stadium, the team did not start playing until the 2014 season. Although they did not play until 2014, they started their operations in January of 2013 and even participated in the 2013 CFL draft. Besides struggling in 2014, they have had a strong start to their franchise, appearing in 3 Grey Cups since and winning the 2016 Grey Cup. Similar to the Cleveland Browns, Ottawa kept all franchise records from the original franchise. The CFL classifies all 3 Ottawa-based franchises that played in the CFL a single entity, dating back to 1876 for record-keeping purposes. From a simple pickup game of football that occurred on November 9, 1861 to the start of 2022, football in Canada has had an interesting history. What started out as football unions governing football has turned into the Canadian Football League, the only football league to continuously operate other than the NFL. Its history since 1958 has been a story of highs and lows, but one thing about the CFL is that it has shown it can persevere through hard times and come out strong.